Good evening, everybody. How are you? Respond to me. How are you? All right, very good. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Tyler. I am one of the staff workers at InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, who's one of the sponsors for tonight's event. As people come in, if you want to make sure that there's like ways for people to climb in, at least some available rows, that'd be super helpful. InterVarsity is an interdenominational Christian fellowship that's been at the University of Delaware since 1945. If you're interested in growing in kind of exploring Christianity, growing in love for God, God's Word, His people of every ethnicity and culture, or His purposes in the world, InterVarsity is something you should consider. So if you want to learn more about that, feel free to grab a couple of the people here. Me, myself, there's some other staff in the room that can definitely talk to you about that. Let me tell you about tonight's schedule. Hopefully you're here to hear about mass incarceration and try and hear some ideas about what we can do. Tonight's schedule is super straightforward. So Dr. Anthony Bradley is going to come and share from his experience and studies in this topic. We're going to then have a Q&A time. During this presentation, if you want to put up the next slide, during the presentation you can send in questions. So we're going to use a program called Slido. So if you go to, I believe Slido.com will redirect you, but if not, sli.do, you'll be able to enter our room code, which is D236, if that's too fuzzy to make out. And there you can put in any question you want. All of us that are on our devices or phones or laptops and whatnot, we'll be able to see all the questions, and you can actually bump the questions you really want to get answered. So you all have a say in kind of what question is. So before you post a question, look and see what other people have posted in there, and then we can kind of get those top questions. We'll have our event goes till 8:30, so depending on how long the presentation is, we'll get through as many questions as we can. So hopefully we'll all be kind of edified as we think through this topic together. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Bradley. Dr. Bradley is the Professor of Religious Studies and Program Chair for Religious and Theological Studies and the Director of the Center for Human Flourishing at the King's College in New York City. He has earned his BS in Biological Studies from Clemson. No one from down there? Okay, cool. He's going to be angry at you for that, probably. So also has an MDiv from Covenant Theological Seminary, an MA in Ethics and Society from Fordham, and a PhD from Westminster Theological Seminary. So he has lots more degrees than all of us put together. He also, before coming to King's College, taught at Covenant Theological Seminary. He's the author of a number of books, including Aliens in the Promised Land, Why Minority Leadership is Overlooked in White Churches and Institutions, and then more recently, the one you're here to hear him talk about, Ending Overcriminalization and Mass Incarceration. In addition to writing books and teaching, he still maintains time to have a very active Twitter account, which is thoroughly entertaining. So I encourage you to follow him. All right, without further ado, Dr. Anthony Bradley.
Tyler, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here tonight. This is, I would say, for your generation, in terms of marking an issue for your generation, in terms of having a massive impact in changing the course of the country forever, this is one of them. In fact, I would even maybe say it more strongly that I think that this is the issue that could potentially mark your generation's impact on the country forever, because you all are in a position to actually do something about it in ways that many people are not. Let me begin by just asking a few questions, and you can just shout out some answers here. Just want to get a sense of where you all are on this issue. How many people are currently incarcerated in America? Anybody know? Want to guess, sir?
A little bit over 2 million.
About over 2 million. Any other guesses? Yes. Yeah.
I think it's
11 million. Okay. All right. Any other guesses? Got 2. Got 11. Any other guesses? Yeah. So currently it's about 2.3 million. Currently incarcerated. If you add probation and parole to that number, it's about 7 million. So about 7 million people who are currently under the control of the criminal justice system, which is a massive part of our population. It makes us the most incarcerated country in the world. Now, in fairness, there are some countries who don't incarcerate, they just kill people. So some of those comparisons aren't necessarily accurate in terms of saying we're the most incarcerated country in the world. Well, we also have a rule of law and constitutions and systems, and other countries don't. And so it's difficult to make those comparisons. Let me offer a couple things, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. I'll tell you how I got involved in this issue, and then I'll jump in. I was taking a class at Fordham University in grad school, and we were taking a class, and part of that class we were studying the juvenile justice system, and I was in there taking a class, and at some point one of the professors presented this data that said that it's when a juvenile experiences trauma, right? A kid sees a murder, a kid sees his mom or dad get beat up, something like that, they're much more likely to end up in the juvenile system. And that's kind of a light went on for me, and I began to realize that we actually are not really locking up like bad kids necessarily, but hurt kids. And then I began to think, I wonder if the system itself is not really about bad people necessarily, but hurt people, because hurt people hurt people. Mm-hmm. And it really began to help me rethink the way the system functions and my role in potentially offering some solutions to it. So this really all began, if some of you may be more familiar with this, in 2010, there's a book titled The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, written by Michelle Alexander. Has anyone heard of this book? Okay. She is no longer a law professor. She's left law completely. She now teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York. She's walked away from the legal profession altogether because she realized that policy will not solve this problem. And what she basically has concluded that real social change on this has a lot more to do with the moral formation of our society rather than simply changing policy. But she's really credited with getting this conversation started with that book in 2010. What I want to offer also is for us to sort of think about the narrative that was presented there, because it also pops up in the documentary 13th. Anyone seen 13th? Anyone? Yes, okay, very good. That there are some ways in which this narrative is crafted, and I want to add something to that, maybe pull a little bit on that thesis based on some more recent data. According to that narrative that was introduced in Michelle Alexander's book, the prison explosion in America was a result of the intersection of race and poverty and the war on drugs. According to the narrative, the drug war disproportionately targets African Americans and low-income communities as a means of social control via the criminal justice system. And this was coined by her as the new Jim Crow. The problem with this mass incarceration as a Jim Crow thesis, however, is that it actually doesn't fit the data. It actually doesn't tell enough of the story. The drug war is actually not the reason that we have 2.3 million people incarcerated in this country today. The first significant blow to this thesis was offered by Yale law professor James Forman in a 2012 article titled Racial Critiques of Mass Incarceration Beyond the New Jim Crow. He's subsequently written a book titled Locking Up Our Own, which he won a Pulitzer for. James Forman Jr. is the son of a very famous civil rights leader, James Forman, in the 1950s and 60s. And James Forman discovered in his research that drug offenders only constitute about 25% of the nation's prisoners, while violent offenders make up about half. Now, while sympathetic to the ways in which those living in poor black communities are more likely to end up incarcerated than, say, middle-class black communities. It is simply not true that drug policy drove those numbers up. Here's why. Between 1959 and 1971, this is before the war on drugs, homicide rates doubled in this country. Between 1963 and 1964, robbery rates tripled. During this time, many black leaders were asking for more police presence in their neighborhoods to curb violence and property crimes. Moreover, Foreman explains, if there was some mass incarceration conspiracy to incarcerate blacks with drug law enforcement policy, it would have been difficult then to explain police activity in cities like Washington, D.C., where a majority black populated, which are majority black populated and controlled. So what Foreman noted is that if you look at cities like D.C., Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit, the black middle class was actually just as punitive as everybody else. Black judges, prosecutors, police, etc. in those cities. The difference was that when the black community was calling for a more police presence to rid their communities of property crime, violent crime, they also were asking for more social services. That's actually the difference. But if you look at DC, they were just as punitive, and James Foreman Jr. does a really fantastic job of elevating that story that many people don't talk about. The fact remains that, by the way, state prisoners constitute the majority of our incarcerated population. So the one thing you have to remember about this issue, this is primarily a state issue, not a federal issue. Here's why. About 90% of everyone incarcerated in this country is incarcerated in a state prison, not a federal prison. So if you care about this issue, you have to care about Delaware or your home state, not what's happening in DC, because the policies in DC don't affect the men and women incarcerated in Delaware. That's not how it works. Okay.
Forehead?
So you have to really pay attention to the fact that it's the states that control the laws and determine who gets incarcerated and who does not. About 50% of those who are currently incarcerated are incarcerated for violent offenses, about 21% for property crime, and only about 20% for drug offenses, and 8% for public order offenses. And Foreman concludes that if every single drug offender in America was released tomorrow, the United States would still have the largest prison population in the world. The second major blow to this thesis of the drug war pushing this was by John Pfaff at Fordham Law School in 2015 in his article, The War on Drugs and Prison Growth, Limited Importance and Limited Legislative Options. Pfaff highlights that overall, only 17% of all prisoners are serving time for drug offenders, and that drug offenders in prison only explains about 22% of prison growth. In fact, if all black drug offenders were released from prison right now, tonight, the black prison population would only drop by 1.4%. Now, according to Pfaff, it's the conduct of prosecutors, who we'll talk about in just a moment, that's actually driving up these numbers, not the drug war. So there's actually, if you look at the data, it's a story that has much broader implications than perhaps what we've heard. There's more going on than just the drug war. These issues are quite broad and of course, complicated to say the least. Pfaff and others observed that while the war on drugs may not have grown their prison population, it may have most certainly contributed to the collateral and social and economic costs, such as reduced healthcare outcomes for the poor, removing men and women from the labor market, destabilizing families, destroying social networks, etc. destroying civic participation, which all opened the door for antisocial and criminal behavior. In the end, the war on drugs has undermined civil society and made many low-income communities worse off in the process. Now, it's also true, of course, that the war on drugs disproportionately incarcerated people of color. But the war on drugs, even with that disproportionate incarceration activity, is not the reason the prison population exploded, because it's actually worse. So I've got bad news tonight, and it's only going to get more badder tonight. It's important that when we look at this story, we have to realize there are multiple variables at work, right? Anyone in the social sciences here? Sociology, whatever, right? So what happens oftentimes is people pursue this with a univariate analysis, right? They look at one variable and they correlate it with a trend. And what we know, and we're taught this, right, that correlation does not prove. I must be out of university, my goodness, right? Right? So correlation does not prove causation. So why did we buy this narrative that like drug war equals prison population explosion? That's way too simple. There's more going on. So I'm going to propose a multivariate analysis. We're going to look at multiple variables, including the drug war, that may have contributed to this problem. Here is some data. 1 in 3 adults have a criminal record. 1 in 3 black boys will be, born today, will be incarcerated. 1 in 34 Americans are now under correctional control. 1 in 28 children has an incarcerated parent. Why is it that those numbers are so high? Because breaking the law in this country is very, very easy. Here's the bad news I've come to tell you today, is that everyone in here is a criminal. Everyone in this room is a criminal. And the question is, why is it that some people end up in jail for the crimes they commit and other people do not? Because everybody in this country is a criminal. And I know that this is true because there are over 4,500 federal laws that you can break. And if you look at the state, there's even more. So there's federal laws that you can break and there's state laws that you can break. I promise you that within the last week, probably by the end of today, you've already broken at least 3 or 4 federal laws. For example, did you know this federal crime 21 USC 3321 CFR 102.39? It's a crime, my friend, a crime. Okay, go to jail, clink, clink, right? Jail. To sell onion rings, resembling normal onion rings, but made from diced onion without saying so. It is a federal crime. It's a crime. You can go to jail, locked up. People visiting you, right, on the phone through plexiglass, touching hands, because you sold onion rings, and they weren't real onions. They were diced onions, that nasty paste stuff. You know what I'm talking about, the little cheap frozen ones you buy? The perfect rings, right? That's a federal crime. Criminal, right? If you've ever had people over and you said, I have onion rings, and they paid you for that, right? You should have gone to jail. It's a crime. Criminal. I won't name, there's a restaurant chain I won't name, Burger King, which sells these things, right? Breaking the law. We should roll up in there and lock everybody up. Did you know? Wait, it gets worse. Did you know? It's a federal crime. Anyone in here ride skateboards ever in your life? Anyone? Oh, a few of you. Okay. I promise you, you all are all criminals. Check this out. Do you know that it is a federal crime right? You're going to federal lockup to skateboard at the National Institutes of Health in DC. It's a federal crime, not a federal crime. Did you know? This federal crime, Tier 1 USC 461 and 9 CFR 381.171. It is a crime to sell turkey ham as ham turkey, or with the words turkey and ham in different fonts. It's a crime. It's a federal crime. And so mass incarceration and overcriminalization is actually a story about why it is that some people who are criminals end up in jail and other people don't. That's what we're actually really talking about. And so what I want to introduce in terms of this multivariate analysis is that it's not just the drug war, that mass incarceration is largely a story about the intersection of class, which was made way worse by race in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and geography, and family breakdown, and trauma, and sensory neglect, and poverty, and mental health, and so on. That we have an overly punitive criminal disposition toward certain groups of people, and we call those people poor. That this country has a history of locking up, rounding up poor people. That's what we do. And we use the criminal justice system to manage poor people. Poor people in this country have always struggled with the status of being considered human by the ruling classes. We don't like the poor. We want them away from our kids. We don't want to live near them, right? So what do? We move to neighborhoods where poor people are not, so that we can put our kids in schools where the poor people's kids are not there, because we don't want to be around them. We don't want to see them. We don't want to have anything to do with them. But we will most certainly use the criminal justice system to lock them up and get them away from us. And this is an old history in this country. On April 5th, 1790, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a law that established the legal foundation for America's first true prison system. This is an incarceration story of how we treat poor people. And I want to propose that finding real solutions to mass incarceration is largely about making sure that our criminal justice system remembers that those who are incarcerated are actually humans. They're not criminals. They're not convicts. Felons are people. And there are people that are breaking the law just like we all have. And that when we infuse human dignity back into the system, and we respect the dignity of both victims and perpetrators, that we'll begin to make some real change. I make the case that this is largely an anthropological problem. In 1985, when everyone was really not paying attention to this issue, a scholar by the name of John Irwin wrote a book called The Jail, Managing the Underclass in American Society. Because this is what we've always done. We've used, since 1790, we've used the criminal justice system to manage poor people. Once new labels were assigned to criminal deviants, they became much more complacent. We became much more complacent as a country about using the law to control criminals, to keep our communities safe. Once offenders lost labels associated with human dignity, social decision makers and lawmakers and voters alike became increasingly agnostic and disinterested following the social turbulence of the 1960s, especially about the quality of our criminal justice system. The level of contempt and disdain for lower class offenders has a much dark and long history in this country. As a society, we have very little patience for poor people, and especially poor people who are deviant. We consider poverty a moral issue. People are poor because they're lazy. So when people make unwise decisions, if criminals end up in a dysfunctional and oppressive criminal justice system, well, so be it. That's their fault. Criminals are getting what they deserve. And so jails and prisons then are places where Irwin says we lock up people called rabble. That's the term that he used, rabble. That's the term for the social deviants in society, particularly those who are poor. Criminal deviants are detached from and not welcome into integrated society with these pro-social norms of conventional community. They're disreputable because they are evil, the rabble are. They're disgraceful, they're inhumane, offensive, dangerous, threatening, untrustworthy, rabble-rousing, unruly, treacherous, destroyers of the common good, and so on. And we must do whatever we can in our communities to keep our children free of contact with the rabble and get our kids as far away from the rabble as possible. And we have done nothing in this country but lock them up. Since we formulated and organized the penitentiary system, which was first started by Christians. Christians are the reason we have our penitentiary system. The Quakers did that. So what was it? You get the rabble off the street and you send them into the penitentiary and you wait on them to repent and then you let them go. So the whole system was set up to get these sort of social deviants out of our communities, and you put them there, and then if they wait long enough, they would perhaps repent of their sins and commit themselves to be different kinds of people. So if you examine the entire history of American criminal justice, not just since the 70s, it's a story of us labeling people rabble and then using the criminal justice system to control them. Now, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, the rabble were most certainly lower class black men. But before that time, different groups were the rabble. If you were in cities like Chicago and Detroit and New York in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the rabble at that time were immigrants. If you were German, if you were Italian, if you were Greek, if you were an Ulster Scot from Northern Ireland, if you were, Irish need not apply. Why? Because they were a rabble. And the same things that people said about the rabble in the 1970s, the sort of black rabble, were the exact same things that people said about these sort of white immigrant rabble in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. These Germans and the Poles, right? These sort of Polish sorts of rabble. So since the Civil War, the rabble in this country has primarily been lower class whites and immigrants and refugees and black Americans and Hispanics. But I've got some news that's even worse tonight. There's a new group on the horizon that we need to think about. So because the history really has been using the system to control the rabble, we need to think about something really important. And the first is this. I'm going to list a few things. We have to think about the role of poverty. I saw that over here. Here's why. People who enter the criminal justice system are overwhelmingly poor. 2/3 detained in jails report annual incomes of under $12,000 prior to arrest. Incarceration contributes to poverty by creating employment barriers and reducing earnings and decreasing economic security through criminal debt and fees and fines, making access to public benefits difficult or impossible and disrupting communities where formerly incarcerated people reside. America has a long history of being overly punitive toward poor people, and especially poor people of color. There's also the issue of lack of education. I saw that one over there. Very good. These folks are very insightful. About 75% of those in state prison and 60% of those in federal prison have not completed a high school degree. There's also a mental health issue. About 59% of those in state prisons and 45% of those in federal prisons report having at least one mental health issue. There's also issues of trauma. There's also issues of substance abuse. About 32% of those in prison report having some sort of disability, vision, cognitive, ambulatory disability, etc., compared to 11% in the general population. So here's some good news. Since about between 2007 and 2009, the arrest rates and incarceration rates for African Americans has been in steep decline. Crime is down in almost every major city in this country. Detroit, even Chicago, New York City, crime is way down. Crime goes down, arrest goes down, incarceration rates goes down. So since the mid 2000s, mid to late 2000, that first 10 years or so, the numbers have been in steep decline. We're now in 2019. For example, in Maryland was already having some incredible declines. Since 2015, their overall incarceration rate declined by 1.2%, in 2016 by 3.7%, and in 2017 they reduced their overall prison population by 9.6%, the biggest drop in this country. So there actually is improvement happening, but it's at the state level. The Trump administration recently signed some legislation that I ran through Congress that changed some of the rules at the federal level that reduced numbers, which is fantastic. It's great. That's great. But that's only in the federal system. And we have to also pay attention to what's happening at the state and local level. Here's some bad news. Bad news. Okay, so this is like 2018, 2019, right? I'm about to get you current on this issue. While incarceration rates and crime rates are declining in the cities, they're spiking in the rural areas. Rural America is now the fastest growing area of incarceration. That's where the increase is. In fact, lower class white people are now becoming the new rabble. Out of the 740,000 people in US jails, 20% are in rural areas. About 33% are in medium and small metro areas. About 27% are in large suburban areas, and and the remaining 20% are in large metro areas. Listen to this. Between 1970 and 2013, the incarceration rate in rural areas increased 425%. By comparison, research has found that since 2019, pretrial incarceration in big cities actually leveled off. But in the rural areas, they've actually spiked. So you're actually much more likely to be incarcerated in a small town in the middle of Delaware or in the middle of Pennsylvania or New Jersey or upstate New York than you would be in Philadelphia or in Wilmington or in New York. What's happening is that what's developed is an urban-rural divide, and we see this most acutely in the South and in the West. And one of the reasons for the significant growth of rural jails nationwide is the increasing financial incentives that such facilities have for renting out their space to both federal and state agencies. According to one study, 84% of those held in jails hold people on behalf of other local jails or state and federal authorities. In the 1970s, fewer than half of U.S. counties reported holding someone from another agency. So rural areas have the highest rates of growth in pretrial detention. So there's something about the ways in which we shift the definition of who the rabble is, that determines, it's almost like sort of like a whack-a-mole, right? It was like, we're gonna get this group, these decades, and this group, this set of decades. And so right now, it's not African American men. The spikes are with rural white folks, male and female, and with women in general. It's also another area. And that has a lot to do with poverty. We also know that prosecutors have way too much power. Prosecutors are the reason that John Pfaff argues that we have the explosion, because prosecutors basically control who gets in and who does not. The vast majority of felony convictions are now the result of plea bargains, about 94% at the state level and 97% at the federal level. So you're charged and you plead down, which means that you actually don't go to court. So over 90% of almost every single charge and conviction is actually decided in the hands of an unaccountable lawyer, not a judge, not a jury, a prosecutor. And there is so much ground for prosecutorial abuse because the prosecutor is accountable essentially to no one. And so there are lots of reforms in place. There are lots of reforms that people are talking about in terms of how we need to address the fact that prosecutors are basically doing whatever they want to do. Poor people also can't get a quality defense, which is a major problem. So you have a situation where those who are incarcerated need good defense lawyers. For those of us who are middle class, we get access to great defense lawyers, right? We call our parents, you call your cousin, you call your uncle, calls his friend, and then next thing you know, you get out. But if you're poor, you don't have access to the best defense. In fact, if you are at the mercy of a public defender, you're often in big trouble. Why? Because the public defender is overworked, understaffed, underpaid, under-resourced. And a public defender doesn't have the resources to actually defend your interests in ways that are to your advantage. Judges often don't have the discretion that they need, because there are state and federal laws that actually keep judges from doing the things that judges need to do. For example, anyone heard of a 3 strikes law? Things like that? Okay, so guess what? Let's say you get charged with something. It's your third offense. I was in Louisiana recently, and in Louisiana, whatever your third offense is, the judge must, by state law, give you the maximum sentence for that offense, right? The maximum. Right? So you get your third offense, and you go before the judge, and the judge can do nothing. The judge is bound by state law to give you the maximum. So judges don't have discretion, because the state legislatures are actually the ones who control what those sentences ought to be. We also have a problem with what's called the school to prison pipeline, where some schools are actually essentially pre-prison facilities that works on 2 fronts. One, under-resourced, understaffed, low-performing, low outcome producing standards of education. And you have that coupled with the fact that police officers are now in schools. Cops are in schools. So there was a time when if you committed some infraction, you might go to the principal's office, you might get detention, you might get suspended. Now, in a lot of schools, you go to jail. Why? Because the cop is right there. In Baltimore, there was a student who stole some milk at lunch and went to jail because a cop was there. And in a lot of schools, what also happens is that teachers and administrators will use police officers to administer discipline in the school. So it's not that if you don't stop talking, if you don't sit down, right, you're gonna go to the principal's office. you're going to go to juvenile detention. So we have to somehow figure out a way to get cops out of school. We basically criminalized adolescence. So the normal things that high school students do, and in fact middle school students do, are actually getting them locked up. They're called school resource officers, school resource officers. So what's important to remember in light of all of this, and I'll say just a couple of things, and then I'll take some questions, is that if we use the system to control people who are poor, who are uneducated, if we use the system as a way to control children, and if we simply attach the label rabble on them, criminal, deviant, etc., and then use the system to simply control them, to gather them up and remove them from the rest of us, we will make no progress, absolutely no progress in reducing these numbers and changing our criminal justice system, which, by the way, is not a criminal justice system, it's criminal justice systems. We have at minimum 50 criminal justice systems in this country, because every state has their own set of laws. So we have to remember that that those who break the social contract and those who break laws are actually people first. And I wonder what would happen if we were actually to create a system that actually had the person at the center instead of ideology, or instead of certain principles about how we treat rabble. What if we had people at the center, people who have stories and pasts and names and things like that? There was a group of studies that I found that just totally blew my mind on this issue. A group of adolescent teens who had violent disorders and conduct disorders were in a facility, and they did a study where they studied the impact of massage versus relaxation videos. And they gave one group, they were watching these videos, you know, like when you go to the doctor's office and you watch like videos of like water and birds and stuff while you're sitting there about to experience pain, right? So they had them watch these relaxation videos, and they gave this other group of teens 20-minute chair massages for 5 weeks. You know what I'm talking about? You sit in the chair, you sit your face in the chair, and you're on your back. You ever seen that in like an airport? 20 minutes for 5 weeks. And guess what happened? Those who had the relaxation videos, there was actually no noticeable change in their levels of aggression, their levels of hostility, their propensity for criminal deviance. But the ones who actually had the 20-minute massages in the chair for 5 weeks, there was a noticeable a decrease in their levels of aggression. In fact, the data shows that depression goes down, anxiety goes down, aggression goes down simply by touch. There's another study I found, 30-minute back massages given over a 5-day period to 52 adolescents with conduct disorders. And what they found is that those who had the relaxation videos, no change whatsoever. But those who had experienced massage reported less depression, less anxiety, less stress, better sleep, better cooperation with adults, and less aggressive activity overall. They were more cooperative with everyone involved by the end of the story. By the end of the study. So essentially then, what the data shows is that those kids who enter the juvenile system aren't bad kids for the most part. They're just neglected kids. actually undermine the system is simply moving toward people and giving them the things that they need because they're human. Something as simple as a hug, a conversation, touch, moving someone towards you can actually keep somebody out of the system. It completely blew me away. That sensory neglect was one of the primary was one of the primary reasons that males in particular enter the system. Here's why. When boys are hurt, when they're kids, they hurt other people when they become adults. When girls get hurt when they're kids, they tend to hurt themselves. But when boys get hurt, when boys are neglected, they tend to hurt other people when they become adolescents and when they become in their late teens, early 20s. Another variable is the dad deprivation. More often than not, if someone enters the system, they didn't have a dad who was involved. They didn't need a married dad. They needed a dad who was actually involved in their story. And so some of these issues are actually not about policy. There's no policy that you can create that would encourage people to literally hug the rabble and embrace the rabble and love the rabble. Because the ways in which we continue to marginalize the rabble actually criminalizes them. And so what do we do when they act out in pain? We lock them up. And so maybe one of the greatest solutions to the criminal justice debacle that we have is actually simply good old-fashioned loving your neighbor. What if we actually invested in people who are on the margins, caring for people, loving people, moving people into our lives who are struggling and suffering? And that primarily is done locally, not at the federal level. So you guys have to vote locally. You have to care about what happens in your state, in your county, because that's where these issues are decided. You have to serve. You want to consider maybe serving in the system locally. We need some of you guys to be on city councils and county commissions. We need some of you guys to be DAs and judges. Some of you guys to serve in the state House, state Supreme Court, social workers, police officers. Get in the system locally. Some of you could be a coach, a father, a big brother, a neighbor. Bringing someone into your story radically changes people's lives. It can change the country forever. Now, Christians have an advantage because we have resources in an institution called church. But we don't actually use it for that purpose often, do we? Christians often use the church for themselves, and instead of using the church as a place to help other people. And until we begin to bring other people into the advantages that we have, we actually won't do as much good as we possibly could. So your generation has an opportunity to do something that we haven't seen, is to radically re-engage how we think about the rabble. Just bust the doors open and mix up your lives so that your lives look really strange to your parents and grandparents because you have people in your lives that you're not supposed to be hanging out with. So who are the rabble? It's the people that you're not supposed to be with. It's people that your parents would freak out if they knew you were dating. Those people. Those are the ones that we actually can include and have a major difference. It takes not as much as we think, and it actually involves everyone. So maybe, regardless of your major, regardless of your vocation, you can have a role to play by offering respect, opportunity, love, care, and affection to people who actually need it. It's really just that simple. We have to love our neighbors and love them well. Thank you very much. there a way to unpack comfort? I'm not here, so is it bad? I have no idea. It's not great. Yeah. So here's something to think about. I think for a community that's largely homogenous, is that fair to say this campus is largely sort of white homogenous?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. So one of the ways, and this is really why I brought up the whole issue about the new spike in the rural areas, is that for this issue you really have to deracialize it, because it really is an issue that could affect any one of us, because we're all criminals. And for a community that's largely homogenous, one of the things that actually can break that down, and I've seen this with actual great success, is to open themselves up to thinking about engaging people who are poor, period, regardless of race. Because it has a way, if you're engaged with poor people regardless of race, it actually has a way of opening you up to other types of people. One of the things that I've noticed over the years about the white middle class is they cannot stand like rednecks and trailer trash people. They can't stand them. They just can't stand them. They don't want to be around them. They don't want kids to know about them, whatever, right? And it's actually quite extraordinary that actual disdain for the white lower class is actually part of the reason that there is sort of racial tension as well. That it's simply they don't like people who are not like them, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter just that you're different by like your skin. You be different by class as well. And middle class people are terrible at not opening their lives out to people who are different. So I've often used, especially in communities where there's a lot of conservative white people, I've actually used the back door of the white underclass to open them up. And I can tell you from experience it actually works. Because then they start seeing the ways in which it affects other people. Because they're open up to seeing a community that actually looks like them being burned by the system as well. That's a great question. My goodness, brilliant person, whoever that is. That's a fantastic question. Here's why. We have got to, and this is why your generation is absolutely vital for this, right? We have to get new ideas about what to do with people who break social contract other than being so punitive. Why is it that jail is our default mechanism for people who actually commit crime? Right? Now listen, there are some crimes where we need to take people and remove them from community because they're not safe, right? But for most crimes, it's not that they are a threat to public safety. They just did something dumb or stupid, or they were acting out because they had some kind of pain issue back in the past, right? So the technical term for that is called diversion. A diversion program. And lots of states are creating different types of diversion programs so that those who are arrested can actually avoid the criminal justice system, the prison system, and do something else. There are lots of them at the juvenile level already. New York has something called, has a youth court, where if you commit a juvenile offense, you go to youth court as opposed to the a regular system. In New York, there's something called Community Connections for Youth, which is another diversion program. And if a juvenile commits an offense, goes before the judge says, hey, if you go do this program, and this program basically says that you have met all the requirements, we'll basically throw your case out. And that's a program that's started by a bunch of Christians. So we actually need some alternative programs to receive people who need to be cared for, loved for, rehabilitated as a way to get them out of the system. So one of the ways to think about this is, what can we do to sort of keep people and rescue them out of the system by creating other opportunities for them to get the things that they need, to get the help that they need, and to satisfy victims. Now, what you tend to find in the data is that victims are actually far less punitive than the system is. So there's something called restorative justice, where you get victims and perpetrators in the same room together. And what we find is that victims are actually less punitive. Here's one reason why. There's not a lot that can be accomplished by an extended sentence that will actually repair a person's harm if it was really severe. It's not going to bring their dead loved one back, right? It's not going to make their trauma go away just because the person is in there for a long time. So victims tend to be far less punitive than the system. So we need to actually create some alternatives to incarceration that's still respecting the reality that there needs to be some sort of retribution and justice for the victims, but also a way to think about bringing people back in the community, because that really should be the goal. Bring them back restore them back in the community. We don't see that often enough. We need some new ideas for that, for sure. Fantastic question. That's a great good question. That depends on the state legislature, right? That's why you have to pay attention to what's happening in your state. I mean, that's where those decisions are made. They're not made in DC. They're made at the state house. So states, I mean, there aren't any rules on that necessarily. So states decide what those rules are going to be, and in some respects, they're somewhat arbitrary. The ways in which we keep felons from doing things like getting school loans, and in some states they can't vote. In some states they're not eligible for public housing. And so what happens is that they serve their time and then they are still punished afterwards, right? Again and again and again and again and again. And so maybe so what has to happen, and this is happening in lots of states, is they're beginning to roll back some of those additional punitive measures. But it's not going to happen, A, if you don't know what those are, and B, if you're not at their state capitol making sure those things happen. So you have to get involved in your state politics to get those things rolled back, because every state actually has different rules about what those things are. You have to get involved in your state. You have to know what those are, and pull them back one item at a time. So the states that are making real progress are beginning to one issue at a time, whether it's banning the box, whether it's restoring voting rights, right? One issue at a time, rolling those back. And that's how we're beginning to see some real progress being made. This is crazy. This is crazy what I'm about to say. I'm someone who likes to sort of think about this by swimming way upstream. I mean, like way upstream. Okay? And I'm equally concerned about the prevention of hurt in the first place, which includes, for example, helping families be strong and creating context for people to have real love and connection and affection. Mm-hmm. People who experience sensory neglect, either being abused physically or not having the affection that they need, end up largely acting out. So there has to be a way that we can, on the one hand, swim upstream and help prevent people from getting hurt in the first place. But if they are hurt, what are we actually willing to do, like really willing to do, to help people heal? And I don't mean a little program on Saturdays from 9 to noon. But if you really want to get involved in someone's healing, that most powerfully happens through relationships, and those relationships happen over time. So if you're going to get involved in somebody's pain story, you're likely getting involved with them permanently. Not spring break. Not every Thursday night from 4:30 to 6. Not just one basketball season. Not just one art project, right? People need real connection. They need to know that people care about them, believe in them, inspire them, coach them. That takes years. It took your parents 17, 18, 19 years just to raise you to be able to do this. And so people that are hurting need people to be committed to them for the long haul, not just a summer. Now, I love the fact that some of these programs exist. Students get introduced to them, what I call it kind of drive-by help, but that's not really helping people. So helping people heal requires multiple contacts of healing love over time. And you have to sacrifice something in your own life in order to do that. You have to. This is what this would require if you really want to do this. Okay? You're going to have to make your life not about like Instagram or your Snap story or where you're going for spring break or what your job's going to be in the future, like where you're going to live. You're going to have to sacrifice something in life, in your own life, to invite some brokenness into it with another person. It's going to cost you money. It's going to cost you time. It's going to be inconvenient. You're going to want to go out on a Friday night. Someone's going to call you like, I need some help, and you have to just drop everything and go help them. So helping people heal requires real contact and intervention over time, and we have to be willing to actually give something up, to sacrifice our time, our talent, our treasure, etc., to actually do that. You guys are probably unaware how much you could actually radically change the life of a 15-year-old kid right now. You have so much knowledge. You don't realize it because you're in college. You have so much knowledge about how things work. How to apply for a job, how to do an application, what to wear, what to say, what not to say. You have so much you can offer right now that would radically change someone's life, but it's going to require a lot of time. And that's what I find Americans aren't willing to give up. They are actually willing to give up time. You cannot heal people without real time. Yes, so the thing that I've found that really wakes people up is actually them seeing real stories. So if you guys do these events in the future, you have to bring formerly incarcerated men and women to tell their story. People need to see it. Not some abstraction on a slide or in a book. They need to actually see that this is a real person. So real stories actually kind of move the needle. That really opens people up. So you have to have real stories for communities where people are disconnected. It's incredibly powerful to have that kind of narrative. Right? So that's really important. Yes, we do, and we want to make sure because of the collateral cost that we're actually managing the violent person properly, right? So we want to remove violent people for the sake of public safety, but we also want to help people not be violent in the first place and help them not be violent anymore. And there's some people who are simply satisfied with just locking them up and not actually helping them be restored to their full humanity. They're perfectly comfortable with them just being locked up. And that's not enough. That is not enough. It's not enough at all. That's not enough. We actually have to, we've got to figure out a way to deal with violence, but also restore people's humanity when they've been perpetrators. We actually have to do that. There are too many people, like I said, satisfied with just sort of locking them up, throwing away the key. That is absolutely not good enough. It's not good enough at all. And that's basically what we've done. We've been really content because they're rabble, right? They're rabble rousers, they're social deviants, they are miscreants. And so once they break the rules, they're out. And we're perfectly happy to leave them out on the margins. And that's just simply not going to work. Think about it this way. It perpetuates cycles of new offenders. Because when you remove somebody from a community, you remove them from all the social networks. There's a large majority of inmates who are actually parents. And so you actually are removing the sorts of stabilizing influences that keep their children from entering the system as well. So if you really want to deal with violence, you have to think about the whole person who is violent, and punishing them cannot be the first and last resort. Great question.
Restorative justice.
What do you mean by that?
Like circle dialogue, restorative justice practices that
Yes.
are being implemented in schools to sort of have kids interacting with the community that they hurt, rather than, putting them in with a bunch of other kids who've been labeled miscreants and deviants and things of that nature, which just further perpetuates the idea that that's all they're destined for and all they're good for.
Yes, I've got something a bit more radical than that. We have to quit quarantining poor people to schools. Right? What do? We create rabble schools, right? And we don't want our kids in those schools. So we move out, and then what do? We use the county commission and the city council to create zoning laws to keep rabble kids out of our schools. So we're quite content to figure out how to remove the prison pipeline system from the rabble school. I'm saying bust it up completely, right? Absolutely destroy the current model. This is crazy what I'm talking about. Right? So basically what we've done in this country is that we have a public school system that's based on a caste system. Because we use property taxes to fund education. That's how we set it up. Right? And we could have every sort of restorative justice program, all these great programs that you want, but until we change the labeling of those kids in that school, in that neighborhood, and we introduce the tyranny of low expectations on those people, we're not going to have any change whatsoever. Because we are more than happy to have cops be over there, not to protect the people from outsiders, but to protect the kids from themselves. So I want to push it. I want to push it, this issue, deep into figuring out ways to decriminalize being a low-income person in a school. Because that's part of the disposition toward low-income schools, whether it's a low-income school in Appalachia or a low-income school in the south side of Chicago. So we introduce these sort of low standards, and then we send in this structure, right? We contain them, and then we introduce a program to make the containment problem less of a problem. That's not good enough for me. Gotta bust that up completely. Gotta bust that up, blow it up, destroy it radically, completely. Now, having said that, we also need some people to be teachers in those schools, administrators and principals on the Board of Education, right? Maybe to be a third grade teacher, because you might have a room full of boys that you will be the most significant influence in their life as a male at 7, 8 years old. Maybe we need some men to go in there and actually show some love, affection, care, connection, and inspiration, and work at it from that angle. It's pretty rare that you're going to find a male in elementary school, anywhere in this country. I don't know what the guys are doing. No idea. Well, actually, the data says they're not going to college or work. So that's a separate problem. That's a separate talk, right? But maybe part of the problem is that we want to address the school to prison pipeline at a distance instead of actually getting involved in it personally. Right? So actually go work in a school district and be a teacher, be a principal, get involved yourself. My mom was a special ed teacher in Atlanta for over 30 years in inner city schools. And to this day, my mom's in her 70s, her students still come by because she got involved in the lives of these kids who are living in housing projects in the 60s and 70s. And some of them are now in their 50s, and they still come by. And because my mom had compassion and care, and because she brought them over to our house sometimes on the weekends, they ate all my cereal and all that kind of stuff, I didn't want them around. It had a massive impact and changed her whole life because she personally got involved. And I think the problem, one of the major problems is that we are so beholden to programs when so much of this solution is about people and relationships. Like hurting people need people. They don't need a program. They need somebody to care for them and to be connected to them and to love them and to speak life into them and encourage them. That's what we all need. We all need that. And the idea that someone who is from a more broken context than yours doesn't need the exact same thing you do is largely where we lose this imagination, I think, for how to help. We want to figure out a way to create alternatives without personally getting involved. That's the middle class way, that's the upper class way. How do we do that? By writing a check, and then we can go have brunch and take selfies. Actually, we take pictures of our eggs Benedict and post it on Instagram, and be content with that. We gotta radically change that. That's not how you change society. You change society, honestly, being straight up with you, a person at a time, not a program at a time. It's a person at a time. Woo! Okay, no. All right, listen. Christians are no better than anyone else at labeling and having disregard for poor people. That's been in this country since 1760. There's a great book called Not Quite White by Matt Ray, sociologist. And he gives this history of how upper class, educated, like highfalutin Christians gave up on poor people, and particularly poor white people because poor white people don't want to change. So Christians have actually adopted, embraced the rhetoric of rabbilizing poor people. And Christians have been historically more than happy to participate in using the criminal justice system to lock people up. I'll give you an example from the 80s. That's a euphemism for the Reagan era. During the 1980s, one of the ways in which Ronald Reagan gained a lot of support with conservatives, including conservative Christians, was to speak about the ways in which African Americans in inner cities were taking advantage of welfare. So he talked about welfare queens. And in the 80s, there was all this rhetoric about predators. In the 80s, you saw this disposition toward the fact that we need to have a war on crime and control the cities, to control those people. And evangelical Christians were right there with them. Lock them up. The Christians often, to their shame, believe that people are poor because they're immoral. That people are poor because they are irresponsible and because they have sex outside of marriage and because they have low morals. That's why they're poor. And Christians have actually played a role in moralizing poverty, which actually interferes with their capacity to move toward and love the poor, because they believe the poor are poor because they're immoral people. They've adopted this sort of rabble mindset. And so Christians have created, they will create programs to go help the poor, but they don't believe the poor are equal in their humanity. So this is what they do. They don't invite them into their homes. They want to help them through a program. I was talking to a pastor. I was speaking at a conference on race in Florida, and he was quite excited. And I'm kind of a wet blanket guy. Like, oh, that's a great idea. Wrong, you know. He was quite excited because his church was involved in some like inner city programs with some men who had been incarcerated, you know, and they have in their church building they have a lunch on Saturdays, and they come and serve them food, right? Look at what we're doing, right? And I just said, well, how many people invite them home after lunch? Crickets. He just stood there and said, well, I guess we should work on that next. That's the problem. Skip the program, skip the lunch, just do that. So Christians, since it's documented, since 1760 in this country, have shown very little difference in how they assign labels of humanity to people who are poor. Very, very, very little difference. Now, in fairness, there have been lots of Christian institutions that were erected to help those who are poor, right? So almost every orphanage, almost every hospital was started by some Christian community. That's why you have St. Luke's and St. Mary's and all these hospitals, right? Almost all the nonprofits, all the charities were first started by Christians in this country. So it hasn't been completely that, right? I don't want to overstate it that way. But Christians have also been very complicit in assigning rabble status to people instead of, because they're Christians, right? So you would think that Christians would be like, no, these are people made in the image and likeness of God. They have the imago Dei. Like, nope, they're rabble, welfare queens, lock them up. And you can look back in the 80s during the moral majority era, in the late 70s, early 80s, through the Reagan era, and you can look at sermons, You can look at articles written by Christians, and they use the same language as the secularists who were assigning and undermining the dignity of those who are poor and found themselves in the system. That's a major problem. One last thing, and then we're done. Okay. So there's a story that has yet to be told about this university. And just in this room right now, it would be great, right, if in 20, 30 years, we're in Florida playing golf, me and Tyler, right? I'm retired in a wheelchair. He's coming to visit me. And we're watching the national news. And there's a story being told of all these incredible reforms and all these things that happen in the state of Delaware, whatever state you're from. And somebody comes across the podium and tells a story about a program that really changed their whole state. And we look, and it's one of you. There's a story yet to be told because your generation has an opportunity to do that. And I really hope, my prayer is that you all will use your imaginations, your gifts, your interests, your connections to get involved in this and make a real difference and actually change the country in the process. I look forward to seeing your stories in a few years. Thank you very much.